Welcome to Groundbreakers, our podcast about real estate and all things real estate development. I am your host, Nick Stilo, and my co-host, Joe Villar.
Welcome back, everyone.
And today we are filming Bourbon with One Urban, where we invite industry professionals to speak about the development industry here in Toronto. Today, we have the pleasure of welcoming Alexander Suriano. Alexander is a partner of the prominent Toronto-based law firm Airden Burles LLP. Alexander's practice focuses on municipal land uses and planning and draws from his experience in the public and private sector to help his clients navigate the municipal approvals process. Alexander advises developers, municipalities, government agencies, ratepayer associations, and members of the public on a broad range of land use planning and development matters, and regularly represents clients before the Ontario Land Tribunal and Toronto Local Appeal Body on appeals. In addition to managing development applications under the Planning Act, Alexander also provides strategic advice to his clients regarding the Municipal Act, City of Toronto Act, and the Ontario Heritage Act. Prior to joining Airden Burles, Alexander worked as a senior lawyer in the City of Toronto's Legal Services Department, Planning and Administrative Tribunal Law section, and is a frequent guest lecturer and author on topics in municipal and planning law. Recently, he co-authored the publication, A Practical Guide to the Ontario Land Tribunal, a guide to planning process and appeals in Toronto. Thank you for coming today, Alexander.
Thank you very much, Nick. Thank you, Joe.
And today we are drinking Wild Turkey 101. And according to the LCBO, it is described as Wild Turkey distiller Jimmy Russell has been making bourbon for 60 years. In Wild Turkey 101, 101 refers to 101 proof or 50.5 percent alcohol by volume. As you sip it, the spirit is medium bodied with a finish that is smooth and warming. With a little water, as Jimmy prefers it, the aromas open up and the heat is diminished. Cheers.
Cheers.
Let's try this one.
Cheers, guys.
Cheers. Oh, that's good.
That's delicious.
Very warming, very warming.
You know, Alexander, a lot of people don't realize what it takes to get a project approved in the City of Toronto or even across the province. Can you outline the key regulatory framework in the Planning Act that governs municipal and urban planning in the province of Ontario?
Yeah, sure. That's a great question, Nick. Planning in Ontario is quite unique. It has a lot of significant features that make it diverse from really any of the other planning regimes that we have in the country. And there's two features that I'll call them that really shape the way planning is done in this province. So the first is that it's a top-down led system. So that means that there's a hierarchy of planning legislation, policies, regulations that effectively frame and govern the rules around planning and what can be developed. So we start, if you picture a pyramid, we start at the top. So there's the implementing legislation of the Planning Act. And then as we move down from there, we have provincial policy statements and plans. In Southern Ontario here, we have the provincial policy statement and the growth plan for the Greater Golden Horseshoe. That's the big one for us here in Southern Ontario. And then we move on to the municipal level. So we have municipal official plans, secondary plans, and then we get down to the level of regulation. So we have zoning bylaws. And then we have special interest plans as well. So things like the Greenbelt Plan, a lot of people have heard of that. Oak Ridge's Moraine Plan that have to do, in those two instances, with environmental regulations. So we have this, again, this hierarchy, this pyramid of legislation, of policies, of regulation that all come together and all relate to each other, and that effectively sets the framework for development. So that's really the first. The second thing, and this is the big difference between Ontario and many of the other provinces in this country, in fact, all of the other provinces, is that we have a specialized tribunal that deals with and adjudicates land use planning matters. That's the Ontario Land Tribunal. In Toronto, for minor variance and consent applications, that's the Toronto Local Appeal Body. And so, again, this is unique in the country, particularly because of the breadth and scope of its jurisdiction, and because, and this is an important part, because of automatic appeal rights. So in Ontario, developers, anybody who's coming forward with applications, landowners, have an automatic right of appeal on their applications. And that creates a system that allows planning matters to seek, you know, this extra level of adjudication. And so these coming together, this planning policy framework and the tribunal system, really create a very unique ecosystem for planning.
So urban planning and city building is a difficult process.
That's true.
What strategies do you employ to navigate zoning laws and land use regulations to achieve clients' development goals?
Yeah, that's a really great question, Joe. I think the starting point is really understanding what the client's goals are. You have to define them. That's everything from understanding, you know, as a lawyer, oftentimes quarterbacking a project or being the sort of point consultant on a lot of development projects. You really want to understand the size, the tenure of the project. Is it going to be rental? Is it going to be ownership? The time frame. What is the intention of the landowner? Are they seeking entitlements, or are they ultimately going to build? Will they actually be carrying this project through? All these affect the ultimate strategy and what you go in for, and then how do you pursue that? The other thing is to understand and get a clear picture of the process. So what are your current as of right permissions? That should be the baseline that all landowners should understand and get expert advice on. And then from there, you can build on what approvals are required to get to your ultimate goal. And, you know, what is the scale of the GFA or the density that's required to make it a viable project? You know, these are the questions that landowners and developers have to answer and have to really think hard about, because it affects ultimately how you pursue it. The next is to evaluate other permissions. You know, sometimes projects, we'll call them, have a little bit of hair on them, right? So they may have some environmental issues or heritage issues which have to be dealt with or have to be mitigated. And so those also need to be factored in. Once you kind of have that picture, you can then begin to truly strategize. And that starts with understanding the roots and application process, building the consultant team. So making sure that you do assemble a team that is able to work within both the geography that you find yourself, but also the particular project and expertise. And then from there, I think it's really important, you know, having worked on the municipal side, you know, I'm acutely aware of the importance of making sure that you do have a clear picture of some of the municipal and ratepayer associations who can affect your project and who should, you know, who will be consulted as part of that process. So things like, who is the local councillor? Who are the staff members that are going to be assigned to your development application ultimately? Who are the local ratepayer groups? Is there a very active organization in the area or interest group? These again affect strategy, and these can be allies as well. So it's really important to be able to identify all the players and then looking at your goals, how they fit into them.
So you touched on heritage there, and 2475 Old Bronte is our purpose-built rental building in Oakville, and that's a heritage property that started with the Wettlaufer House that was designated by the town of Oakville and the Ontario Heritage Society. And it was extremely challenging for us to be able to build on a heritage site, particularly because our site was a smaller site, roughly about 287 feet of frontage by about 131 feet of depth. So when you've got this heritage house that's now designated, typically those heritage houses get isolated on their own and a building is built around them. In our particular case, we were able to negotiate with the municipality to incorporate that building. So we actually physically took apart the heritage structure, the heritage home, brick by brick. We cataloged it, and we are going to rebuild it into the new structure right now, coming up in the next month or so. What are the challenges with a heritage property, especially given your experience and your history with the Ontario Heritage Act? What are the challenges for a developer in building on a heritage site, and what type of negotiations happen behind the scenes with the new municipality for a developer to build on a heritage site, and in particular our case, which you worked on as well several years ago, on incorporating, dismantling and incorporating a fully designated heritage house into a new building?
Yeah, again, it's a great question, Nick. And you know, Old Bronte is a really good example and illustrative of how the heritage process works in this province. You talked about the conservation of the heritage building through dismantling, categorizing brick by brick, and then the recreation on site in a configuration that is incorporated into the development. This really speaks to what it means to conserve cultural heritage buildings and properties in this province. Conservation does not mean, and this is something that is really important to understand, it does not mean in every circumstance that you have to simply freeze in time or to encase the property or the building in amber. That's not what it means. There are many strategies for conservation. And that really depends on the particular building, on the particular property. And I say property specifically because cultural heritage is not limited to the bricks of a building. It can constitute as well the circumstance or the configuration of the building, its location, views to it, features of the property itself. So there's this much more robust system of heritage that has to be contemplated. But going back to the issue of conservation, it's important to recognize that conservation doesn't just simply mean that the building stays in situ forever as it was. So that leads to the issue of strategy when you're looking at heritage designations and heritage listings, because there's two steps in the process in this province.
That's right. First, it's listed, and then it's designated.
That's right.
Once the resources have been put towards evaluating a property's significance to history.
That's right. Yeah. So listing is kind of the first step. It's the early warning system, if you want to think about it that way. A municipality will identify a property as having some cultural heritage significance. There will be a listing statement which defines what exactly is that cultural significance, what features and elements of that building or property are intended to be preserved or conserved. And then that goes on to the Municipal Heritage Register. And that's a process that's outlined under the Ontario Heritage Act. That's the first step. And what that does is really, if a proposal for demolition comes in or a demolition permit application comes in, that application has to wait and to give the municipality time to seek a designation. That's the higher standard. That's actual protection under the Ontario Heritage Act. So there, again, there's this two-tier system. The first step in looking at a heritage building is understanding, or a property, a building with potential heritage, cultural heritage value, is what step of the process is it in? Is it listed? Is it designated? Or is it identified the municipality as potentially being listed and then designated? And that's important because recent changes to the legislation, Bill 23 brought this in, makes the listing, Municipal Heritage Register listing, much more fluid. So now properties that have been listed or that will be listed have a 2-year time frame within which they have to be brought forward for designation. If they are not, they come off the list, they are delisted, and then they have to stay off the list, or they cannot be relisted for 5 years.
Well, that would have certainly helped us out back at O'Bronte, because we bought the property when it was listed.
Right.
And went through the development process and the application, and it was ultimately deemed as a heritage property.
That's right. That's right. Yeah, exactly. And so that traditionally has been the strategy for many municipalities, is to undertake oftentimes what they also call batch listings, where there are a group of properties potentially together or individually that may have some cultural heritage significance. And because the standard for listing was much lower than designation, they were able to be listed on the register. And they'd sit there for this early warning system to effectively trigger as development came forward. Now that's changed. It's a little bit more fluid, and properties can and will come off the register after a 2-year period. The other strategy that's really important to understand is to define particularly and work with the municipality to define the specific features that are of cultural heritage significance. Because the definition of those features, the identification of those features through a heritage agreement or heritage easements will ultimately tell you what parameters you have for developing around them or incorporating them into your development, or the level of conservation that's necessary.
Which I think in our case worked out, because
Right.
Our heritage house did not have any historical significance based on the people that lived there, but more of its design vernacular that's no longer seen in the province of Ontario. It was a very early Edwardian architecture or Edwardian inspired architecture in the province, and it's no longer seen. So the town of Oakville really focused in on its architecture more than any person that actually lived there.
Yes.
And in that case, we were able to negotiate incorporating this into the building, as opposed to building a much smaller building and keeping this heritage house on the side.
Yeah, that's right. And then so when you get to the level of definition where it's a particular architectural feature or architectural style, there is the ability to replicate that style in the new development as well, and echo it. And those are all strategies that come into what exactly does conservation mean for this particular development, for this particular site.
And we've actually done that in the old Bronte building, which is designed by BDP Quadrangle, another prominent architecture firm here in the city of Toronto,
know them well.
where the home is located in the village of it's in Old Bronte, but it's in the village of Palermo, and Palermo being paying homage to Palermo in Italy, and how you've got these cascading mountain side with homes that are kind of stuck on the side of this mountain. If you look at the design of our building, it's got this design feature where the brick cascades down till it meets this heritage home at the bottom, and that's how we were able to highlight the heritage features of this house.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's a perfect example of where you can conserve through development, where development actually enhances the features of the building that are intended to be conserved and enhances the cultural value of it for the long term.
Now, that took us a long time.
Right.
The heritage alone took us about 2 years to navigate through with the municipality. And that brings me to my next topic of time.
Yep.
And the time that it takes for, we're in the city of Toronto, so we'll pick on Toronto for a moment. The time that it takes for the city of Toronto to approve a development is typically anywhere between 10 to 34 months. And across the GTA in its entirety, it's actually about 20 to 24 months. That's a long time. And the Planning Act specifically states that a site plan application needs to be approved within 30 days. Otherwise, it triggers an automatic appeal for the developer to be able to appeal the municipality as to why their application hasn't been approved. But let's be real. An application, in the type of buildings that we're building, is not something any municipality can go through in 30 days. So is the act perhaps flawed, or is the municipality not doing enough to approve those in 30 days? I mean, do you think that an application the size of the buildings that we're applying for can actually be approved in 30 days?
Yeah, I mean, I think the simple answer is no. The scale and the complexity of development, particularly that we see in an urban center like Toronto, which is a global city, it's the fourth largest municipality in North America, clearly require a level of sophistication and review that 30 days is a tight time frame. Particularly when you think about the scale of development applications that we have been seeing, not so much recently, but in the past decade or so, when we really saw the condo boom effectively change the face of the city. So simply put, and those timeframes for non-decision appeals have changed. They have been shortened through more recent legislative amendments. That said, though, there is a world where 30 days would be enough if their municipalities were properly resourced, where they had the proper amount of staff. And so it is a bit of a balancing act, and there's a lot of, I'll call it, culprits that add to the length of timeframes for development review.
And what would that be?
Well, I think, there's a couple things. The first is and again, having worked in Toronto, having worked in a municipality, I know how hard municipal staff work. And I do know that the volume that they have undertaken has been tremendous, and so it is difficult to process just the sheer quantity of applications that are coming through this city. That said, though, the second is the process itself. Oftentimes, it has the ability to get snags in it or to get caught. So the commenting, circulation, and review process can be a major holdup. And this is a major, and this is something we hear every day from clients. It creates a system where one or two departments can hold up an entire project, right? They could be technical issues that again are really dragging the process and the review process down. So I think in terms of how to streamline these projects, there has to be a little bit more direction internal to the municipalities in terms of who's leading this process, as well making sure that the circulation process adheres to strict timelines. And there has to be a bit of a filtering of comments to make sure that the comments aren't contradictory, that when you do get comments back, they're something that are clearly understood and are actionable, and don't recreate more difficulties on subsequent submissions. So I think that all together, would help improve the system, but it takes a little bit of work from, I think, all sides, but also from the municipalities to really work hard to streamline and create a more centralized process for development review.
So in terms of development review, let's talk about Bill 23 and Bill 109,
Yep.
which was introduced by the Ontario government in 2022, which prioritizes building homes faster and incentivizing developers to build more purpose-built rentals and affordable housing throughout with the reduction of development charges on purpose-built rentals and the elimination of DCs and community benefit charges altogether. Do you think that this bill is making an impact?
Yeah, Bill 23, Bill 23 really did, I think, came as a bit of a shock to the entire industry in terms of the amount of changes that it was intending to bring forward. There are important elements to it that were intended to speed up the process, things like fee refunds, consequences for not adhering to those strict statutory timelines for review. But those also engendered other problems. So
Like building infrastructure for municipalities.
exactly, building infrastructure for municipalities. They did create, the move from Section 37 to CBC, community benefits charge, the phasing in of development charges, development charge freezes. I mean, these are all, it's a balancing act, and some of them did create issues with respect to municipalities' ability to really plan for and accommodate new development. The other thing too is the change to the process, in an attempt to speed up. So things like development application refunds did create new challenges on the front end of application processes. So pre-application consultations became much more robust. There were more requirements at the front end of the process before you even got your application in, or were allowed to get your application in and deemed complete. And so these became challenges that landowners and applicants had to face, and complete applications became a really big issue, or have become a really big issue more recently. Now, what we see with Bill 185, which is the more recent legislation that is now working its way through the legislature.
You mean the cutting red tape to build more faster?
That's right.
Or more
yeah.
homes faster.
More. They have
Some
great
of these
names.
names are wild.
They're really they really do have a great marketing group there with the names. We see some walking back of some of these changes. So things like the development application fee refunds have now been are proposed to be removed. So the changes it's a bit of a balance.
And these are an impact to the municipalities. I mean, Bill 23 ushered in some real changes in development charges.
Right.
That if you're building purpose-built, it's going to reduce your development charge fee, and it's a tiered system. On a 3-bedroom, it's something, I believe it's 25%. On a 2-bedroom, it's 20%, and on a 1-bedroom, it's 15%. And if you're building affordable housing, it eliminates the development charge altogether.
That's right.
And that poses a big problem for municipalities because, the old thinking of growth builds for new growth is now abolished by Bill 23, because if they're not getting all these development charges from the developers that are building purpose-built buildings, well, where are you going to get the money to build new roads? Where are you going to get the money to build sidewalks and so on? So on the one hand, you have the municipalities that are shrugging their shoulders and saying, how are we going to continue to build our city? It's not all about buildings, but it's about sidewalks and roads and sewers and water distribution. So it really is a challenge for both the municipality and developers to build purpose-built rentals. And while Bill 23 does help the developers, it kind of really does hurt the municipalities in a way too.
Yeah, it's quite interesting. I was having a really good conversation the other day with some former municipal colleagues at the city in planning, and so I won't take credit for the analogy. And one of them said this, that Bill 23 was kind of like the heart attack, where municipalities had to look and really get the health check and say, what are we going to change? Because the current process isn't working, and clearly there's these externalities that are now recognizing that. Externalities being legislative changes, right, from the province, and so what we see in the post Bill 23 world is and I think an effort by municipalities to accommodate those changes. Sometimes those result in more frustration for developers. Sometimes, though, they have resulted in some benefits. So we have seen um, some more recent approvals that are being sped up. So applications, because of the more robust front ending of pre-application consultation, we see that if someone goes in with a, we'll call an application that is responding to the comments that they received through the pre-application process, we do see those move much quicker.
The public often criticizes developers for making a lot of money or for raising the cost of housing. But it's a lesser known fact that the cost of a new condo in the city actually has quite a bit of municipal fees built into that cost. I believe that the cost is somewhere north of $200,000 per condo unit is going straight to the municipality, whether that be through development charges or community benefit charges or application fees or permit fees or whatever. And it's not a common known fact, but it is a fact that there is oftentimes a third of the cost almost on a $600,000 condo is all going towards the municipality. And municipality fees are going up every year. I mean, the City of Toronto Council voted an increase in development charges by 46% in 2022. And these fees are passed on to the purchasers. Are these increases justifiable? What kinds of studies are municipalities bringing forward to the development community to say, yeah, here's our study to justify a 46% increase on a development charge, which in the City of Toronto, is, on a one bedroom is $80,000. So, now that one bedroom development charge is going to go up to $120,000. I mean, and more. So, are they justifiable in most times?
Yeah. So, I mean, Nick, that's a good point. And we have seen through more recent updates to DC bylaws significant increases in terms of the percentage of the DC charge on a per unit basis. So, I mean, that is a trend that we've obviously seen. It's no surprise that development charges go up over time, but we have been seeing
46%.
That's right. We have been seeing some significant jumps. There have been legislative changes which have reduced the municipality's ability to collect development charges early in the process. Things like the phasing in provisions, which were put in by Bill 23, and when you try and determine whether a DC charge is justifiable, what you really are doing is you have to look at the DC background study, and the time to do that is when new DC bylaws are being brought forward by municipalities through those studies and then brought to council. That's the opportunity for members of the public, for developers, for major landowners in municipalities to take a look at those and to really scrutinize whether or not the charge makes sense. The Development Charges Act allows for and says that growth should pay for growth, right? And that eligible costs for increased services tied to new development should be paid and borne by new development and new units coming forward. But you have to look very closely at those studies and see what exactly is being included and whether it fits within the framework of the Act, and whether they're appropriate services and whether the services being calculated are.
So should a new developer pay for old sidewalks to be rebuilt?
No. So, I mean, that's something that has to, that's the scrutiny that has to be undertaken.
We've seen that.
Yeah, exactly. And so, you have to look at, I mean, one of the things that, and, I'm not a cost consultant, I'm not an expert in this area, but this is why we retain the experts to go through these studies with a fine-tooth comb and look for things like, are there allocations to benefits to existing development that are being inappropriately folded in to the development charges and allocated towards or being miscalculated, and then those percentages are actually being allocated and borne by new development. Those are the types of analysis that have to happen at that scale and at that time, because the time to challenge a development charge is when the bylaw comes forward. Mm-hmm. After that, when they're in force,
they're really just indexed every year based on the interest, right?
They're indexed, and the ability for a landowner to challenge when they actually get they have to go forward and pay their DCs at the time of building permit is much more limited. The Act allows a landowner to make a complaint, but on very limited grounds. The amount of the development charge would have had to be incorrectly calculated. There would have had to be a credit that was misapplied or not fully applied, or there was an error in the application of the development charge bylaw itself. It's not, you can't challenge the actual quantum of the charge.
Have you seen that municipalities have overestimated costs in the past?
Yes, I mean it's absolutely occurred, and it is not an infrequent occurrence when a new development charge bylaw comes forward that certain landowners will appeal it and scrutinize that charge.
Do you feel, in your opinion, that this is the municipality's response to the Ontario Bill 23 and how they're legislating this?
Yeah, I think in light of a lot of the changes to Bill 23 that really took a pecuniary that affected municipalities and their ability to collect fees in significant ways. Everything from development application fees to DCs to parkland rates to former Section 37 community benefits, now community benefit charges. They all affected the finances of municipalities. And so, of course, there, I think, is naturally an attempt to recuperate some of that lost financial revenue through the development process. But the question is it appropriate? Is it within the four corners of the Act? And that requires close scrutiny and a close eye from the development industry, lawyers like myself, cost consultants. Everyone has to sort of make sure that when those development charge bylaws come forward, they do really fit within what is an appropriate development charge.
You've seen a lot of crazy things, I'm sure, over your career as both a public lawyer as well as a private lawyer. Can you share one experience without naming a municipality or a client?
Sure. I can. It's an interesting question. The craziest thing I've seen. I will say this.
Every industry has a crazy
every industry and
thing that sticks out. I mean, I've got one. I'm sure Joe's got one. I definitely, you've got one.
Oh, absolutely. You don't think land development has more than its fair share?
Oh, definitely has its share of crazy incidents.
So I'll say this. The craziest. I'll tell a story in a moment. But I will say this. The projects. I have had the privilege of being involved in really tremendous projects, both when I was on the municipal side and now particularly on the private side, working with developers like yourselves who are building really wonderful projects that contribute to the communities. Things like rental buildings and purpose-built rental, which is desperately needed. And so I have to say, those they're not they may not always be the craziest, but they are the ones that are most meaningful to me because they really do give back to the communities that they're in, and that's what good development does. In terms of the craziest, it's funny. I've worked on projects of all scales, massive projects. Currently involved in the largest open land site in Toronto, one of the largest sites in North America, is my understanding. That said, though, it's funny. The smallest ones are the ones that get the most attention, both from the public and the neighbors and the councillors. So in terms of the craziest, when I was at the city a couple of years ago, and I don't know if you guys remember this, but there was a big furor in the media about a treehouse that was built in the shape of a pirate ship.
I remember that.
Remember that?
I remember that.
Yeah, remember that? It was in Swansea, so West Toronto. And so a treehouse is really an accessory structure.
Yeah.
And of course, it was built without building permits.
Sure. Of course.
And
As it typically is.
as typically treehouses
Go to
are.
Home Depot on Saturday morning and
Except
buy
this-
a whole bunch of wood, right?
That's right. Well,
Start building.
this was more than a couple of 2x4s. I can tell you that. But it was this massive structure in the backyard, and it did not meet setback requirements.
Nothing. Zero.
It created issues with respect to coverage of the property, and so 311 went and inspected. They had to get variances. This came in, it was refused at the Committee of Adjustment, and ultimately there was a concern with respect to there was some opposition, and the local councillor opposed it. And so I was the city lawyer assigned to this. And I mean, this one was in the news every day. I had to go site visits, climb up into this.
How was it?
I mean, it was pretty amazing. If I had to be honest.
Was it at least well built? Was it structurally sound?
Yeah, it helped me. It was structurally sound. I'll be honest. I don't know if it was really built for kids I mean, it was pretty significant. Anyways, in the end, crazy it's just because of the context, because of the uniqueness of the planning issues that we're dealing with, treehouse. And ultimately we settled. So it's kind of a good news story. You know, everyone.
Did the city make them pull it down?
No, the city did not make them pull it down. And there was this little bit of a back and forth between, you know, this structure is a massive annoyance to the neighbor. And then also, you know, this is a play structure, and who wants to be seen as pulling down a kid's wonderful treehouse? So in the end, settled.
Yeah, that
It's a
doesn't bode
happy
well.
story, but definitely one of the craziest. Not the biggest, but the craziest. In my
Speaking
career.
of craziness, this Wild Turkey 101 is actually a really, really good bourbon. We did not add water to this, as was recommended by the producer, but I don't mind the heat. Actually, the heat in this bourbon was really, really good. It's got a nice little bite and it's got a long finish. I really enjoyed it. What'd you think?
I think, you know, it's surprisingly smooth for the proof, and yeah, great to sip. I don't think it needs water.
No,
No.
agreed.
The aromas really open up. So
Cheers.
let's enjoy it.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
And with that, groundbreakers out, where bricks are laid and dreams are built. Until next plot twist, happy building.
Till next time.
Let's go. Good job, man.
Was that okay?
Fantastic.
That was great.